Our topic for today is running a little along the lines of our lesson in the adults class. So what's the lesson in the adults class? One of the adults, if you can give us a very quick rundown. Not a rundown, just one word. What was the lesson about the last couple of weeks? Samuel. Yes, the lesson was about Samuel. And as a little child, what happened with Samuel? He went to... How old was Samuel when he went to work as a priest in the priesthood? Does anyone know? No? He was younger. How old? Someone said 2. Yeah, he would have been around 2 or 3 years old because it says when he was weaned. So he was very young when he entered the priesthood. And today we're going to talk about another child who left home early and had a very important work. But before we do, in our world today there are so many choices, right? We have so many choices and paths that we can take. And it pulls us in all different directions. But there's a battle for the mind. The battle for the mind is whether we follow God's way or whether we follow the way of the world. Are we going to serve God or mammon? Because it clearly says in the Bible we cannot serve 2 masters. We cannot love one and the other. We must serve one or the other. And so for our young people, particularly these days, there is a great battle going on in their minds, and we don't even notice. We don't even see it. And a lot of times we don't take the care to notice. There are many distractions and influences that influence our young people these days. Far more than there was when I was a child. We have video games, we have iPads, we have TV. Disney's a big thing. But it also can be some amusements and sports that draw our children away. The movies, everything has become so easy to get these days that we don't even know, a lot of the times, what our children are looking at. And they absorb it all like sponges. Now, what sort of effect do you think that has on a child when all these influences around them are coming in their heads? We try and steer them in the right direction, don't we? And in Proverbs 14, verse 12, there's an interesting verse there. It says that there is a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Sometimes we think we're following the right path, we're doing everything we can, and yet we see people still walking away and ending up in the world. And we need to ask ourselves, why is this happening? We bring our children up in a way that we think is right, but are we doing things the correct way? Are we watching them? Are we really keeping an eye on these things? And so we see that the children form habits right from little young age, right? You see children of different ages. When my kids are at school, they were at school for the last few years, and you see that the habits that they have at home, they bring to school, and then what happens? They integrate with each other, and what ends up happening? Some of them follow the bad habits, and some of them, very, very few, follow the good habits. But let me ask you a question. When is a good time to start good habits? Proverbs 22 verse 6 says to train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old he will not depart from it. Now I want to share some things with you this week, today, scientific things that have been observed by psychologists. And now I have the name and the study of the psychologist written down, but I won't share it with you here. But they give steps on how a child develops from the ages of 1 and upwards. So I'll share that with you. Can a baby learn? Studies by, oh there, I've got it there. Studies by Jean Pelget, by a development biologist. So from the ages of 0 to 24 months, the development from simple skills such as sucking and grasping. You see the baby is constantly putting their hands in their mouth, trying to grab at things. They're trying to perceive the world around them, and it's very simple. There's 3 main things a baby needs, and that is food, love, and generally a clean nappy. And that'll make them happy. Not always. It's hard. Sometimes when you've got a little baby and you're not sure what's going on and they cry, but generally that's the 3 things that they need. Their actions produce consequences. They start to learn these things. They learn patterns that when I cry, I get fed. When I cry, I get changed. And these simple things start to develop a pattern for them. And that's when you see a lot of children will start to have these tantrums, because that's when they know that if I really throw a tantrum, or if I make a big song and dance, then people will pay attention. Would you agree with that? Yeah, good. By 24 months, they know how to get a reaction from parents, family and friends. From the ages of 4 to 7, 4 to 7, children begin to speak more and interact. They also ask many questions and begin to challenge what is being asked of them. Have you had that happen to you? Parents with children, have you ever had that happen to you? When you say to your child, can you please go and do the dishes? Well, I don't want to. Or, you know, have you made your bed? Why? Why do I have to make my bed? Why do I have to go to school? Or kindergarten or whatever it might be. Why do we do this? Why do we do that? I remember I had 3 daughters at almost the same age, twin daughters, and Chantal was only young too, and the questions were flying. Why? Constantly. And you, as a parent, you've always got to come up with answers. And the answer's never good enough because I said so, right? If you answer the children because I said so, eventually how do they grow up? They grow up and they say to their children because I said so, and with no reason. And we need our children to do things and say things for reason. Just like God does with us. He asks us, don't eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Do not do this. Don't go those places. You won't gain the blessings if you do this and go there. When sometimes we don't ask the question why, and maybe we need to. But this is the age where they start to ask why. Concepts formed are crude, and this is interesting, are irreversible. Now, I did a course, probably 3 or 4 years ago now, and it was called Landmark Education. Now, I don't suggest that anyone should do this course, because in the end, I found out that they used some kind of way to warp your mind into going a certain path that we don't believe in. But there were certain elements of it that were really, really good. And that is, I started to understand a little of why I do things. Why do I have a fear of this? You know, you have children who grow up and they've got a fear of heights, or they've got a fear of water, or they don't like certain foods. It's because in the years between the ages of 3 and 7, something has happened in their life that is irreversible. And that has happened to me, a few things. And going back and thinking about what happened when I was 4, what happened when I was, in these ages that go, now I know why I don't like this, and now I know why I'm scared of that. We must be careful what we do with our children. And I remember one of our school teachers telling us, do not let your children watch the news. Do not watch the news in front of your children between the ages of 4 and 7. And I thought that was ridiculous. And then one night, we were somewhere and we're watching the news at someone's house, and Chantal was about 6 years old. And she was so petrified from then on, she was having these nightmares that, certain things were going to happen that she didn't need to know about. The stock market's going to crash. And what's the stock market and who cares, A 7-year-old doesn't need to worry about these things, but it worried her mind. The other thing is that magic is very real. But perception of right and wrong is not developed, and rules and lines may be blurred. And this is why the Lord asks us to be the conscience of our children as they're growing up from young. God has put us in a position that we are to bring up our children in such a way that brings the right and the wrong to their minds. Would you agree? We are the guardians of our children. They're not ours. They're the Lord's. In the period of 7 to 12 years old, it's called the period of concrete operations, is the term that they use. A child starts to think for themselves. I see that now with some of my children. Now that they're getting to be a little bit more grown up, I don't have to ask them to go and do certain things. They get up in the morning, they make their bed, they brush their hair, they go and have breakfast. Yeah, you've got to remind them a little bit. But the things are starting to make sense to them, right? It's not a matter of just because mum and dad said so anymore. They're thinking about it and they're acting upon their thoughts. Their likes and dislikes are very strong. And this is a stage where some reversibility is now possible, okay? Things that they did between 7 and 10, they learnt these bad habits. Now you can do something with them at this age. You can reason with them. Okay, we cannot do this because of these reasons. Now, I notice that with my children too. You sit down with them and you say something to them and you see the spark coming in their mind and they go, that makes sense. And so some things are reversible. And the child can now start reasoning from cause to effect. And then from 12 years onwards, thoughts become more abstract, incorporating the principles of formal logic. Thinking becomes less tied to concrete reality. So as adults, we know that as a child, when you say something's going to happen, generally it happens. But as an adult, you know that there is some flexibility there. And you can know what's right and wrong to be able to change or not change in that flexibility. They become independent and harder to change, less receptive, and their own ideas are cemented in their minds. Now I want to bring you to a story in the Bible of a child who was with his mother until he was 12 years old. And this is very interesting. This is a study that has been done in the last 10 years. And this is pointing out things that God had already showed to the children of Israel how many thousands of years ago, right? So let's go into our story. Now I'm going to read it from Patriarchs and Prophets, and I want you to think about who it might be. Because I'm pretty sure you're going to know, and then we'll discuss who it is and what it means to you. So God had heard a mother's prayer. Her faith had been rewarded, and she faithfully improved her opportunity to educate her child for God. She endeavoured to imbue his mind with the fear of God and the love of truth and justice, and earnestly prayed that he might be preserved from every corrupting influence. She showed him the folly and sin of idolatry, and early taught him to bow down and pray to the living God, who alone could hear him and help him in every emergency. She kept the boy as long as she could, but was obliged to give him up when he was about 12 years old. Yet even here he did not lose the impressions received in childhood. The lessons learned at his mother's side could not be forgotten. They were shielded from the pride, the infidelity and the vice that flourished amid the splendour of the court. Any ideas who that was? Sabella? No? Sister Tapatu? Moses, right. What happened with Moses? He was found in a little basket. The princess said, I want this baby. Miriam came out of the bushes and said, I know someone who can look after him. And he stayed with his mother, or taught by his mother, until what age? 12 years old. Now, going back to what we just learned from a professional in the last 10 years, what did the professional say? Your mind can be moulded. Things can be done up until about the age of 12. The bad habits that you can learn can be unlearned, right? But after 12 years old, it becomes almost impossible. So we see here, in God's infinite wisdom, how long was he with him? Up until about 12 years old. Now, I thought about the story of Hannah too. But it's a slightly different example there, because who did Samuel go to live with? The priests, God's people, right? So he wasn't going into the world. Slightly different situation. But here we see that Moses was taken to the courts and taught what? If you read through Patriarchs and Prophets, if you read through the Bible, he was taught all forms of Egypt, everything that they could teach him. They taught him history, art, warfare. They taught him magic. They taught him everything. Yet, what did he stay true to? What he'd been taught from the age until he was 12. Psalms 127 verses 3 to 5 says, "Lo, children are an heritage to the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. As arrows are in the hand of the mighty man, so are children to the youth." Now imagine this. Picture your mind where you're in a battle and you're an archer. How useless are you as an archer with no arrows? How useful are you? Useless. Absolutely useless. A bow's not going to do anything against an army with no arrows. And it says that arrows are in the hand of the mighty man as children of the youth. That must be pretty important, yeah? I just thought of the thing between them. Children are important. "Happy is the man that hath his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with the enemies at the gates." Now, everyone's quiver, which is what holds the arrows, is a different size, yeah? You can only fit so many arrows in a quiver, and some people have a bigger quiver than others. My quiver is full. But it says, "Happy is the man who has a quiver full." The Lord blesses you with your children. So what's the parents' duty towards children and child guidance? It says the work of parents, which means so much, is greatly neglected. Awake, parents, from your spiritual slumber and understand that the very first teaching the child receives is to be given him by whom? By you. By mum and dad. Now, how often do we grow up? We send our children to kindergarten. They learn from the influences of kindergarten, and then we send them to school, and they spend 6 hours a day at school. And then when they come home from school, we wonder why they fight, and we wonder why they want to watch TV, and more important, or Looney Tunes and all this sort of stuff than they do in doing their lesson or being obedient, because they've been trained by someone else. And we get about, a couple of hours in the morning, or not even, and that's all about getting dressed, getting your hair brushed, getting in the car, getting ready for school. And then when you come home, it's all about making dinner and getting ready for bed. So those are good things to learn, don't get me wrong. But what about the influences that they learn during the day? Is what we're doing in the morning and the evening seeing them through the day? Are we having our morning and evening worship? Are we setting them up with the Lord before they enter their day? You are to teach your little ones to know Christ. This work you must do before Satan sows his seeds in their hearts. Satan doesn't ask for an opportunity to sow seeds in the hearts of your children, does he? He doesn't ask you if he can sow seeds of discontent in your heart as an adult. So why do we think that he would, give the kids a mess? The kids are important. What we do with our children will play a part for their eternity, not just their eternity, but for future generations, the people out here that live all around this church. How are they going to know the truth if our children are not brought up in a way in which they want to share the gospel? Christ calls the children, and they are to be led to him. And who remembers the Bible verse where it says, unless you become as little children, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven? You think about that. You think of the importance of children in the work that they have to go forward. You start to have a picture in your mind about why Jesus was so insistent that we must become as little children if we are to enter the kingdom of heaven. Another question we have to ask ourselves is, who influences our children? Who influences our children? Can we wonder that children and youth drift into temptation and become educated in wrong lines where they are continually associating with other neglected children? You know, sometimes we don't think about that. Can we wonder, neglected as they have been, that their energies become devoted to amusements which do them no good, that their religious aspirations are weakened and their spiritual life darkened? Now, sharing from my own experience, we lived in Kaikohe for close to 10 years. Kaikohe is not a very big town. And there's not very many good influences in Kaikohe, I can tell you that. And it's overrun with gangs now. But when we grew up there, I never felt closer to God than I ever have in my life. I felt so close to God because my parents wouldn't let us associate with the ratbags in town, you know. And so we spent our times in working in the garden and studying. I remember every Sabbath, because we didn't have any people around, we would have people come to our house for Sabbath. And so I would spend Sabbath mornings, I'd get up 6 o'clock in the morning and I'd prepare a sermon. And I'd preach to my teddy bears. and that for me was a spiritual time. And then when I came and spent more time with children in the church, you spiritually wander away because parents are not training their children and you're associating with them. We must be careful for the sake of those around us as well, that we bring up our children in a way that is pleasing to the Lord. How can you tell a good influence from a bad influence? Well, in Proverbs 20 verse 11 it says, even a child is known by his doings, whether he be pure or whether it be right. Now, we are told not to judge, correct? Judge not lest you be judged. But there's a fine line between judging and making sure that you're being a good parent. And sometimes you have to make these judgment calls. Because even a child is known by his doing. You know, there's another way of saying that. It just slipped out of my mind. Sorry, just slipped out of my mind. But, you know, when you see the influences that people have around you, are you going to go and associate with that, or are you going to pull away? In the job that I'm working in now, I have guys who are working for me who do a bad job. Now, you can have someone with a good attitude and doesn't know how to do their job, and you can train them, right? Or you can have someone who does a good job and has a bad attitude, and it's just as bad. But when you have someone who's bad work ethics and a bad attitude, are you going to judge them or not? You know, have to move them on. And we have to make these decisions in our life. Now, there are some people around us who don't know any better. Is that correct? You know, are we in a world of perfect people? No. Does that mean we shouldn't associate with anybody? No. We're to be in the world but not of it. But that doesn't mean we should pull away and not spend any time with others. Because what is our duty? Our duty is to spread the light, right? Remember the song, "This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine." Satan's going to hide it? No. I'm going to let it shine. And so we're to be an influence to our neighbourhood. So we can't just pull ourselves aside, can we? We're not just going to put ourselves in a little, you know, put a big hedge around us and say, oh, we're the children of God and we're not going to spread anything to others. No, we can't do that. Our duty is, well, we're going to find out what our duty is. There are those who don't know, but what is our duty to those who don't know? Very popular verse, very well-known verse. Put up your hand if you don't know this verse. I think most people know this verse. That our duty is to go out and teach all nations, right? When I was asked to head up the Sabbath school department in Australia, I went and did a whole lot of research. I wanted to know why the Sabbath school department was so important. What is important about the Sabbath school? It's a meeting that we have from 9:30 till 10:30 on a Sabbath morning to fill in time while everyone arrives for the divine service. And that's what I was taught, you know. It's a fill-in time. We sit there and read from the lesson. What is question 1? What does God say about, you know. And then someone gets up and reads the verse. The verse says blah, 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 blah. Right? And that's what our Sabbath school is. Is that what our Sabbath school should be? I want to share some things with you about the Sabbath school and how that works in about this. And just for a point of interest, when I studied about the Sabbath school, I discovered why the Seventh-day Adventist faith went from being this 5 or 6 people to being over 20 million people in a very short time. Do you know how that was? It was those faithful people on Sabbath having a school of young people and teaching them. And I'll have you know that there was a Sabbath school department before there was a general conference. And so the work was done through the children. Yeah. It also says that if we don't cry out, the stones will cry out. The work has got to be done through the children. If we want our church to expand, if we want the message to go out, we've got to target the children. The children are our next generation. The children are the ones who are not embarrassed to walk down the street and say, hello, my name's Allegra, and I go to the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement, and I love Jesus, or whatever your name may be. But this is the case in our case. We used to go to the park, and Allegra had no problem walking up to anyone and saying, hey, I'm Allegra, and I love Jesus. Imagine if we did that as adults. The boldness of Paul and Barnabas and Silas, sorry. So what is our duty? Gospel Workers 434. Are we doing all that we might and should do to diffuse the precious light of truth? Are we? Are we doing all that we can? Or are we embarrassed? Or are we too busy? I know in my daily life, and you can ask Jonathan. Jonathan can attest to the fact that my life is very, very busy. But are we doing all that we can to diffuse the light of truth? Brethren, you see the truth. You understand the claims of God's law. You know that no willful transgressor will enter into life. And yet you see that law made void in the world. So what is your duty? Are you not to ask, what is convenient for me? What is agreeable? No. What can I do to save souls? What can I do to save souls? Now going back to the Sabbath school, what is the most effectual way to bring souls to Christ? Is it through the missionary work? Could be. Is it through the sermon on Sabbath? People have been led to believe through the sermon they've heard? Could be. Is it the young people's meeting or the prayer meeting? The Sabbath school should be one of the greatest instrumentalities and the most effectual in bringing souls to Christ. Why the Sabbath school? Why the Sabbath school? Because we're learning. Right. Let's go another step further. I'll ask you a question. Why is the Sabbath school not very effective today? Why are there people not flocking into churches? The previous page says the Sabbath school, when rightly managed. So we have a little bit of a clue. When rightly managed, possesses marvelous power and is adapted to a great work, but is not now what it may and should be. And I'll have you know that this was written in a time when the Sabbath school was booming compared to our day. That's why our churches are dead. We have no Sabbath school that is effective. It's not rightly managed. And the list goes on and reasons why. There was a publication put out by the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventist Church in 1925, and it says, it's a little book called The Soul Winning Sabbath School. Beautiful little book, very hard to get, but I've got a couple of copies, and if you want an electronic copy, I photocopied the whole book. I had it put into PDF. But it says, the heart is to the body what the Sabbath school is to the church. Now tell me, how many people here have ever seen someone living without a heart? Yes or no? No. You can't live without a heart. And even if you took the heart out, you might live for what? Not even two minutes. Yeah? And you'll die. You get rid of the Sabbath school, and guess what? The church slowly dies. But what is the Sabbath school? Why is the Sabbath school so important? Why is the Sabbath school why does it have such a power? Well, the Sabbath school is not just one or two things. If you look at the original Sabbath school, before we had an organised general conference, the purpose of the Sabbath school was for Bible study, for fellowship, for local mission, and for foreign mission. It's not all about me. It's not all about this church. It's about who's out there. Who's in the next island over? It's not selfish. It affects teens, children, adults. It can even have a really good effect on Bible workers. And I saw that in Australia when some of the Bible workers got on board and they really, really pushed the Sabbath school. And I tell you what, their groups grew like you wouldn't believe. It is the missionary work. You cannot separate the missionary work from the Sabbath school. The Sabbath school and missionary work are one department. They are one force because one is the other. It affects the local church, the field churches, the conference groups, the branch Sabbath schools. That's something we don't even have, something we don't even talk about as branch Sabbath schools. What is a branch Sabbath school? I'll tell you, we have probably 2 or 3 of them here in New Zealand and you wouldn't even know about it. We have one in Whangarei. We have one in Palmerston North. What's a branch Sabbath school? Does anyone know? No? It's a group of people who get together and worship on Sabbath and put the principles of the Sabbath school work into practice. And we have some brethren up in Whangarei and we have brethren in Palmerston North. But we should have more branch Sabbath schools. We should have far more branch Sabbath schools because the branch Sabbath school is the missionary work for that area. And that grows into a church, which then grows. It greatly influences the literature department. How does it influence the literature department? What does the literature department produce? Our Bible school, Sabbath school lessons, right? It produces our leaflets, our pamphlets, our good tidings, all these wonderful books that get put together. And then what do we do with them? We spread the word, right? We give them out. Now, in our day and age, our literature department is probably a little more electronic than it used to be. And so there's even greater influence that we have. We can get to people instantly. We don't even have to walk out of our house. I had a Sabbath school class on Facebook. And we had our little Sabbath school classes not on Sabbaths, but every single day of the week. And that worked really well. And I made contacts in Philippines. I made contacts in Nepal with a guy who is now studying to become part of the church and has brought 2 congregations of 70 people each, all through the work of the Sabbath school. You tell me, is the Sabbath school a great power? Amen, it is. In conclusion to my study today, there's a few things that I wanted to bring out and tie this all together, knit it all in together. We tend to neglect the children, and we don't put the spiritual emphasis on children that we need to. We say that children are only children, they'll grow out of it, they'll learn later. No. Children know and understand now. They might not grasp it fully, but they need to learn the principles now before it's too late. Children are important to Jesus. What did Jesus say? Suffer the children to come unto me. Forbid them not, for of such is the kingdom of heaven. If you want to be in heaven, you must become as a little child. The other thing is they need a proper education. And it's not an education that the world can give. Even in counsels to Sabbath school workers, it says that parents should not expect their children to go to Sabbath school to learn of Jesus. That's also the job of the parent. But they're to come to church to share of Jesus. Now, that's not always the case for some families because maybe their parents don't understand or know about Jesus. But then that's our duty to share. I would say we need to establish branch Sabbath schools for all children. You know, when we were in Takaroa, we used to have children riding around on bikes all the time. No parents around, needed some entertainment. What happens with them? What influence could we be for them? You know? What could we do to put something there for the children around our neighbourhoods that don't have a good influence around them? Children are the next generation of youth and ministers in our churches, so we need to be careful and we need to put in them, instill in them the love of Jesus and a spiritual life. The children and the youth will be the ones that finish the work. And the Sabbath school, when rightly managed, can be the most effectual instrumentality to bringing souls to Christ. Now, a few years ago, we put things in place by which we can help people to realise this, to bring this to fruition. And I'm pleased to say that there are churches out there that have taken this on board, and you've seen their congregation expand. And so, brothers and sisters, I'd like to see this here, in our hometown, in our city, in our village, in our neighbourhood, that we have the influence that we can have over the youth and young people in our areas. Some of those things were that in 2015 we declared the Year of Children, and it's been our focus ever since. Now, I know you probably haven't seen this so much here, but now is the time for us to move forward and catch up with everyone else. All Sabbath schools around Australasia have been studying from the same lessons for the last, since 2015, 3 years. And all classes have now been able to retain their Sabbath school offerings for projects. Okay? Previously, all monies that were collected in the Sabbath school used to go to RLPA for printing our lessons and printing out literature. And I just wanted to point out that one of the very first projects that was ever done by the Seventh-day Adventist Church through the Sabbath school was to build a boat and sail it to Pitcairn Island. And Sister Betty can attest to that. She knows all about it. And so that was a small work that was done way back. And we can do that today. So I'd like you to encourage you, when it comes to the Sabbath school, give of your offerings, because those are the things that we use to move the work forward. In Melbourne, we had a big question raised where we were living about health. And so they started cooking demonstrations. But how do we fund the cooking demonstrations? They did it through the Sabbath school funds, because that's a mission. And it was the mission that that church decided to take on. Another church took on the mission of feeding and clothing the homeless. And we'd hire a bus and we'd take them clothes and food and just that personal bond with them. And that was a mission in itself. We got to know them first by name, And when you sit down on the side of the road and talk to a homeless person and ask them and talk to them about their story, you start to feel very humbled, because you don't understand someone's life. My dad always said to me, don't judge a person till you've walked a mile in their shoes. And then you understand them. There's also a children and youth mentoring program that we ran, and I'm willing to run here as well, called PACE, and it stands for Principles of Applied Christian Education. And we go through the Sabbath school and how we actually can do projects. And we did that at the last missionary school, ran that through the last missionary school for a whole week, and we saw the results of that. So it's my wish and prayer today that we will take the youth and the children more seriously, that we will reach out and bring the community in, that we can be a blessing to everybody around us. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.